Okay, everybody. How are we doing? Fine, I hope. Well, let me just lay out for you a couple of competing considerations that I weigh in discussing my personal views and also discussing my personal behavior as it comes to voting. On the one hand, I do think that there is something worthwhile about journalists, people operating in a journalistic capacity, such as myself, being maximally transparent as to their political views and their, in particular, voting conduct. Because what would justify a journalist just concealing their voting habits from the public if they want to establish trust between themselves and their readers and viewers? I mean, there is a justification for that, and it's a long-standing one within the more, I don't know, establishment or mainstream journalistic precincts. But I've always been of the mind that rather than attempting to adhere to any kind of outmoded journalistic objectivity doctrine, which is always phony and untenable, I instead, as a remedy, I'm just going to be as maximally transparent as possible with my readership and viewership and whomevership. And then they can make a determination as to how they see that as impinging or not on my credibility. They can take into account my voting behavior when they assess whatever it is that I produce. So I do think that there is an imperative to be at least transparent about that. Now, on the other hand, the concept of journalistic transparency has almost gotten redundant in the past several years because I don't know about you, but it's seldom ever a mystery how journalists operating out there on social media or wherever feel about Donald J. Trump. Like they have no reservations about telling us exactly what they think about Trump, and by extension, I think an inference is generally reasonable to make that they are not going to be voting for Trump and would like to see him out of office. Now, obviously, there is exceptions for the more overtly conservative media, but the journalists who would tend to be the ones who would abide by a traditional objectivity doctrine where they're very hush hush about their voting preferences and they would never even dream of revealing it in public, they have kind of jettisoned that whole concept by making it more than abundantly clear how they feel about Donald Trump and how that would translate to their voting activity. So, in a way, I am almost weary of journalists being transparent with their views. Like, it's almost been an overdose of their views in these past few years. And their views are always very tediously coupled or infused with elaborate first person narrative where we'll have to hear about their trauma, have to hear about how endangered they are, have to hear about how tired they are, and Trump has everything to do with that, apparently. So, I almost would prefer most of the time now that they just shut up rather than us having to hear what is it they have to say. However, I don't think that aversion that I now have to the promulgation of journalists' personal views or people in the media, and again, media journalists, so all kind of a very fluid and nebulous category at this point, because almost anybody can do something that technically constitutes journalism if they so wish. Uh, all that being said, I don't think that necessarily eliminates what I think is at least something of an obligation to be maximally transparent with you, the viewer, the reader, the whoever. And so I mentioned this in a previous video, sort of in passing, but I thought it's worth getting onto the record that no, I did not vote for Donald Trump. No, I did not vote for Joe Biden. I left the presidential field blank on my ballot because that's what I chose to do. I chose to abstain from the presidential election. Now, I did vote on some local matters where I live in Jersey City, and there is a statewide public question, it's called, in New Jersey on marijuana legalization. So I voted yes on that, and that's what I chose to do. Now, I should also add that there is another incentive for me to be maximally transparent about this because constantly, over and over and over again, I get accused of harboring beliefs or I get accused of planning to take actions, voting or otherwise, that I don't plan to take. And I'm accused of harboring beliefs that I do not hold. And please don't ask me for examples because I can give you so many, it's almost unnecessary. I did link to one such example in the Medium post that is sort of the springboard for this little YouTube chat. And of course, as always, you can read that Medium post because it's linked in the description box of this video. But as I don't want to call myself prominent, but I have enough of a platform where people always take it upon themselves to tell me what it is that I believe and even who it is that I will be voting for. So that most commonly over these past 4 years has been accusations that I will vote for Trump or did vote for Trump. I haven't. I'm sorry. I never did. Didn't in 2016. Didn't in 2020. And if that angers you as a Trump supporter, tough luck. If that makes you ever more skeptical of me as a Trump opponent or whatever your precise affiliation is, I don't know what to tell you anymore because I've been consistent about this from day one vis-a-vis Trump. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a conservative. Or at least I don't consider myself a conservative as per it's popularly defined. So I have no real reason to vote for Trump. I never have. Trump is governed more or less like a conventional movement conservative with a bunch of idiosyncratic communication style gambits, meaning his communication style, his PR strategy is very much heterodox. We've never had a president who acts and speaks and tweets quite like Donald J. Trump. And I don't know that we ever will again. On a policy level, more or less, he's governed as this like a movement type conservative, with a few exceptions. I mean, he hasn't prioritized entitlement reform, which is a departure from, let's say, George W. Bush, even though Bush couldn't even get through privatization of Social Security in his second term after he had won re-election. But nonetheless, there's not much that is in my self-interest to vote for Trump, and likewise with Biden in a way. Like I don't have much confidence that Biden is going to deliver on anything that I especially value. And I, as I write in that piece, in the sense of values, I have always elevated foreign policy as the lodestar of my voting choices since I first was able to vote, since the first election that I was eligible for in 2008. Looking back, I don't know that I would have necessarily articulated it in exactly this way in 2008. But looking back, and then I kind of developed this rationale into 2012 and 2016, now 2020. This is like my fourth election, I guess, that I'm eligible to vote in. I had always thought that there was some kind of unspoken obligation for those of us, and I would include myself in this, who are aware of the nature of the modern U.S. nation state, aware of the global military presence that the United States has as the world's hegemonic power, aware that the U.S. projects force across the entire world constantly, aware that the US taking a certain policy tack has implications for people all over the world. So there is, I would think, something of a moral obligation to at least take that into account when you're making your voting choice. And I take it a step further and say that it's my most important issue. And I have to say, it's not clear to me that Biden would be all that much of an improvement on Trump in the domain of foreign policy. He could be worse in certain respects. I don't think Trump is good. And I don't think that Trump not having started a war is necessarily a massive point in his favor. I mean, it's something worth noting. It's worth noting. Okay, I admit it's worth noting that Donald Trump has not started a new ground war. That's an extraordinarily low bar, but if that's the feather in your cap, I concede that. At the same time, Trump has been screaming about ending endless wars now for 4 years, longer than that if you go back into the first campaign. And what's been ended? He uh, escalated the war in Afghanistan. Apparently, he's trying to end it. Although, if you're the commander in chief, you could just end it. I mean, that's one of the benefits of having unilateral control over the military. I mean, you can just end foreign conflicts if you so choose, and it hasn't happened. And you're running out of time. I mean, you got a couple days if you'd like to do that before the election. So I think we can safely assume it's not happening. He's issued various orders saying, "Oh, we're withdrawing from Syria. We're getting our troops home." Blah blah blah. Hasn't happened. He first issued that order in December of 2018. It then got sort of bogged down in the bureaucratic chain of command. Issued another order in October of 2019, and that was really just shifting some troops around in Syria at the behest of Erdogan. On and on and on. Tried to initiate a regime change coup in Venezuela at the urging of Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Marco Rubio, Elliot Abrams. I mean, it strains credulity to say that you'd like to end wars, and then you bring on John Bolton, who I understand Trump doesn't like now, but he made the choice as president in 2018 to bring John Bolton into his administration. So how is that a sound decision-making attribute? Not to sound like an MSNBC normie, but Trump kept saying that he would only surround himself with the best people, and the people around him have not been the best, to put it mildly. Now, in saying that I'm not taking the affirmative step of voting for Trump, doesn't mean that I can't acknowledge that there have been some benefits to his presidency in foreign policy in particular. I mean, I think the concept behind his direct diplomacy in North Korea was laudable, like getting on one-on-one terms with Kim Jong-un was a superior option than doing what Biden's probably going to do, which is, retrench away from that. Biden actually, in the final debate last week, compared Kim Jong-un to Hitler, so we'll see how that gets interpreted in terms of the upcoming potential Biden-Kim Jong-un relationship. I doubt that's a great starting point for it. And there are other, I guess, arguable benefits of the Trump foreign policy. Like, it is actually a mark in his favor that he has to start a war for, even though that's an extremely low bar. But then again, I mean, the whole, what he campaigned on in terms of, reducing substantially America's footprint, because we're getting a raw deal on it around the world, and redirecting resources to American infrastructure and stuff like that, hasn't really happened. And then in terms of the heterodoxies that Trump campaigned on in 2016, in which I think propelled him to the presidency in large measure, those were heterodoxies that countervailed the standard Republican line on a lot of things. And I just don't think that he's governed with much of that in mind. Now, he'll say he has. A lot of the rhetoric tries to give the impression that he has. But, I mean, there's a reason why every Republican, many of whom were extremely skeptical of him in 2016, and not every Republican. I'm talking about, the movement conservative apparatus, the Heritage Foundation, all the NatSec elites for the most part, with a few exceptions. To the extent that there are any Republican defections from Trump, it's largely in the domain of foreign policy and national security. So I give him credit for that, I guess. But there's a reason why so many erstwhile Republican skeptics, like Lindsey Graham is a great example, who were reticent about Trump in 2016 are now all on board because he's delivered to them what they want. He's, in a way, breathed new life into American movement conservatism. And I don't think movement conservatism is particularly worth salvaging, and Trump has at least temporarily done it. I mean, we'll see what happens with the culmination of this election. It could have been, the wrong bet for movement conservatives ultimately, but that's sort of speculation. We'll see soon enough. And what are his signature legislative accomplishments? He talks about the First Step Act a lot, which I think is mostly good. I don't have any problem with the First Step Act, but it is interesting to me that he's now campaigning on releasing federal prisoners, which okay, good. I agree with the spirit of that, but that's kind of not really consistent with what he campaigned on in 2016. But that's a side issue. The legislative accomplishments, in terms of what was delivered in the first 2 years where you had unified Republican control of government, were corporate tax cuts, and that's about it. They wasted a whole lot of political capital on failing to repeal Obamacare, so that was a huge priority for them, of course. And in terms of signature legislative accomplishments, you can get tax cuts. And I don't think that's what propelled Trump to the presidency in 2016. Yeah, to people who have their taxes cut generally like it, yeah. But I don't think he won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin because he was promising to cut taxes on like Amazon. And so if he does lose, which, I mean, who knows for sure, difficult to say. I think a lot of the blame will have to be pinned on Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, and by extension Trump himself, but those two were actually the ones who drove the legislative agenda in the first 2 years when Trump had a somewhat tentative or tenuous coalition that he needed to build upon from 2016. It's not like I know they don't compete with the popular vote. I accept that and grant that. And I've hectored people who try to make more of a fuss out of that than is due. But if you don't win the popular vote, you got to expand the coalition by doing things, I would think, that are consistent with the heterodox principles that you at least inchoately espoused in 2016. I don't see that. Now, on Biden, again, the criticisms of whatever that I'm leveling at Trump now don't mean I'm voting for Biden. I did not. I have not voted for Biden. Here's what I keep coming back to. My political consciousness was raised, I would say, not to be melodramatic, but I came of age in a political sense in terms of when I was first aware of stuff. During the Iraq War, that was when I was old. That was the first time I was old enough to be cognizant of most of political matters in a meaningful way. And given how formative that was, given how repellent I've always found it that the people associated with bringing about the Iraq War have faced no consequences, for the most part, and in fact have ascended through the ranks of elite society and prestige, I don't know how I can almost be, in a way, be faithful to my younger self and cast an affirmative vote for somebody who authorized the Iraq War. I know it seems like distant history now. I know people have moved on or whatever. And Biden, you know, I think he just goes wherever the wind blows in terms of the center of the Democratic Party. So it's not a guarantee necessarily that he'll get on board with some other Iraq style escapade, although who knows? But still, I mean, there are certain lines that can't be crossed. Or there are certain sins that ought not to be forgivable. And by the way, Trump isn't necessarily immune from this charge because guess who? Because guess what? Mike Pence voted in favor of authorizing. That's right, the Iraq War. So Biden and Pence are in perfect agreement on that issue. Um, and then Trump brings on board to his administration some of the most unrepentant pro-Iraq war hawks in the country, like Bolton. So, I mean, he almost doesn't get a pass on that either, even though he wasn't obviously in government at that time and couldn't cast a vote. Um, but that's sort of a deal breaker for me. I mean, I don't know. I am not even in the sense that it's a live issue in 2020. Clearly, it was a long time ago. But last year, September of 2019, I was in New Hampshire. I went to a Biden event, and I spoke to him briefly. I mean, you can go find this article if you'd like. And he came up with this whole convoluted, just straight up phony explanation for his conduct in 2002, 2003 that whitewashes history, where somehow he's saying he opposed the war before it began, or he opposed it just after it began, when he was integral, not quite as much as Hillary, but he was still an integral actor in generating the support that was needed to get the Iraq War authorized. And if you believe, with I think full justification, that it was as big of a, I don't want to say blunder, a moral wrong, a calamity, pick your uh, adjective or noun there, then there's something that I think ought to compel planting your flag on that, and just not giving in no matter how much time passes. And I applied similar logic to Hillary in 2016. I think it is probably worth noting that Biden appears to be less of an unrepentant interventionist than Hillary was. So I think he's marginally less likely to do something extraordinarily ill-fated military-wise in terms of war, peace, etc. But can't rule it out. Can't rule it out with Trump either. And so, with all that in mind, I'm holding fast to my belief that it's not incumbent on me to make an affirmative judgment as to who deserves the presidency between the two main choices on offer. And so I left my ballot blank, and that's it. You can agree or disagree. All I would say is, if you feel compelled to vote, and I don't hold it against people who feel compelled to vote, and I think there are defensible reasons why you would vote. I mean, I'm not denying that. But I would just say that try to at least be cognizant of the fact that you are being inundated with propaganda across the spectrum right now to an almost astonishing degree. One type of propaganda constantly being heaped upon us is this idea that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Oh my God, blah, 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 blah. I'm so effing tired. All caps. Like the future of humanity depends on if you vote for Joe Biden. Western civilization will collapse if you don't vote for Donald Trump. I mean, no, this stuff is all propaganda that's designed to emotionally manipulate you so you give your imprimatur to political elites. That's what it is. And again, I'm not discounting that there are important aspects, arguably, to this election. But the hyperbolic, nonstop, apocalyptic terms in which the quote stakes are cast are just not defensible. I mean, they don't hold up to scrutiny. They're not rational. So if you're going to vote, Do it rationally. Don't do it because you buy into this propaganda that's being forced down your throats. That would be my plea. And you can take it or leave it. You can read the Medium article that I wrote where I get into this in a bit more detail. And I hope you appreciated my explanation here. And with that, I will see if I have any super chats. Samuel, Mike, wouldn't you just for someone other than the two in the mainstream, but how someone like Brian Carroll, not familiar with that individual? Sorry. Estev, what is your opinion of the third party candidates? I'm not that interested in them, frankly. I mean, the Green Party, I don't think is really worth entertaining. Um, Not that I necessarily disagree with elements of the platform, but it's just sort of a lark. I mean, if you're not going to have a real campaign operation, why bother? And same goes for the libertarian, who I frankly, I mean, as somebody who lives and breathes U.S. politics for better or worse, usually worse, the fact that I haven't even really been compelled to look that deeply into the Green candidate and the Libertarian candidate, I think speaks to you, gives you some sense as to their lack of relevance. Because at least in 2016, everybody was pretty familiar with Gary Johnson and Jill Stein. This time they're afterthoughts, and I think that's reflected in. I don't even think they're afterthoughts; they're barely even registered, and I think that's reflected in the fact that consistently over the course of this campaign, the polling has indicated that far fewer Americans are stating a preference for a third party candidate. So much is polarized. And I think, that makes things pretty tedious. Just to end here, as you may know, I have been going around some of the swing states for the past week or so, week and a half. And I was in Pennsylvania for while, mostly in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. Then I did go to Montgomery County in Philadelphia for a while. Went to some early polling sites, talked to people, just try to take a temperature to the best of my ability. These are obviously going to be anecdotal observations, but it's better than nothing. And I would say that my rough sense is that a lot more people are engaged in this election than even they were in 2016. So anybody who might have not voted because they're apathetic or because they didn't have a strong preference or because whatever the reason, they're, I think, more likely to, on a whole, have bring themselves to vote in this election. And I have my hunch that benefits the Democrats. But again, how could I be absolutely sure? Because if you go to a lot of these early voting places, it's mostly Democratic voters by and large. So maybe I'm getting a bit of a skewed picture. I don't know. I have something, an article coming out in Pennsylvania tomorrow, hopefully. So I'll get into that in a little more detail once that is out. So stay tuned. All right. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. You know the concluding remarks that I typically make. It's stay safe, stay cool, and stay sane. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated. Whether you vote, whoever you vote for, if you don't choose to vote, try to maintain some semblance of rationality in your outlook in this final week before the election, which I know is a difficult ask, but it's worth aspiring to because I think having fortitude in terms of your own mental equanimity is extra important when there are such all-consuming onslaughts of omnidirectional propaganda hitting you. And so if you can do that for the next couple days, I think you're going to be better off. All right. Good night.